Hi everybody, welcome back after a break. I hope you are all safe and healthy and well. The book that I chose to read today is one of my favorites. It's a super special book to me. It's called Thank You, Mr. Falker. And what I want you to think about as we start this book is that learning is something that happens for everyone. No one misses out on learning, but learning doesn't happen at the same time or at the same speed for everyone. And this story is about a girl whose learning journey takes longer than it does for some kids. In the springtime, one of the things that grows and tends to really change is our learning. And no matter how old you are, or no matter what grade you are in, I have noticed that in the springtime, things that are sometimes really difficult earlier in the year become just a little bit easier and more fun than when you're at the beginning of the year. And that's the case no matter where you are and what you're learning. And this is a story about a girl who took quite a bit of time to learn to read. And I want you to listen to how that goes. And some of the parts in this book might make you a little sad, and that's okay. Sometimes we need to go through things that are sad to get to the happy things, and that's definitely what happens in this story. But I think you'll like how it turns out. So even if you start to feel a little sad in the middle, don't worry, because it'll turn out in a way that I think will make you really happy. It's about a girl and a teacher and her journey toward learning how to read. So I hope you like it. Thank You, Mr. Falker. One of my favorite books ever. And you know how much I love this author and illustrator, Patricia Polacco. We've heard a lot of her stories. The grandpa held the jar of honey so that all the family could see, then dipped a ladle into it and drizzled honey on the cover of a small book. The little girl had just turned 5, so just a little bit younger than most of you and the same age as some of you. "Stand up, little one," he cooed. "I did this for your mother, your uncles, your older brother, and now you." Then he handed the book to her. "Taste." She dipped her finger into the honey and put it into her mouth. "What is that taste?" the grandma asked. The little girl answered, "Sweet." And then all of the family said in a single voice, "Yes, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee that made the sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book." Before we pass this page, I want to talk about that word, knowledge. Knowledge is a word that means all of the things that you know. So the things you've learned in your life become your knowledge, and it's all of those things that stay in your head. That's what knowledge is, things that you've learned that stay in your head. The little girl knew that the promise to read was at last hers. Soon she was going to learn to read. Trisha, the littlest girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher mother read to her every night. Her red-headed brother brought his books home from school and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandfather or grandmother read to her by the stone fireplace. When she turned 5 and went to kindergarten, most of all she hoped to read. Each day she saw kids in the first grade across the hall reading, and before the year was over, some of the kids in her kindergarten class were reading too. Not Trisha. Still, she loved being at school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her and watch her do her magic with the crayons. "In first grade, you'll learn to read," her brother said. In first grade, Trisha sat in a circle with the other kids. They were all holding Our Neighborhood, their first reader, sounding out letters and words, and they said boy, boy, and look. The teacher smiled at them when they put all the sounds together and got a word right. But when Trisha looked at a page, all she saw were wiggly shapes, and when she tried to sound out the words, the other kids laughed at her. "Trisha, what are you looking at in that book?" they would ask. "I'm reading," she'd say back to them. But her teacher would move on to the next person. Always when it was her turn to read, her teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved up into the second reader and the third reader, she stayed in the first reader. Trisha began to feel different, and she didn't like how that felt. The harder words got for the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. How she loved to draw. Or just sitting and dreaming. Or, when she could, going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandma were walking together in the small woods behind their farm, and it was twilight. Twilight is when the sun has gone down, but it's not dark yet. So you can still see outside, but you can't see the sun, just before it gets dark in the evening. The air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from the grasses. As they walked, Trisha said, "Grandma, do you think I'm different?" "Of course," her grandma replied. "To be different is the miracle of life. You see all of those fireflies? Every one of them is different." "Do you think I'm smart?" asked Trisha. Her grandma hugged her. "You are the smartest, the quickest, the dearest little thing ever." Right then, the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms. Reading just didn't matter so much. Trisha's grandma used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming from the other side, and she used to say that someday she would be on the other side where the light comes from. One evening, they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. "You know," her grandma said, "all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass or you'll lift right off the ground, and there you'll be." They laughed and both hung on to the grass. But it wasn't long after that night that her grandma must have let go of the grass, because she went to where the lights were, on the other side. And not long after that, Trisha's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. So to make sure you understand what just happened, her grandma passed away, and then so did her grandpa. And sometimes when we have something in our lives that makes us really sad, it makes it even harder to learn. Because when Trisha was going to school now, she was not thinking as much about reading as she was about missing her grandma and missing her grandpa. And that happens a lot. That happens a lot when something's happening in your life that makes you sad or makes you worried. It's sometimes hard to think about what you're doing in school. And that's what happened with Trisha when her grandma and her grandpa passed away. Reading was just plain torture. Torture means it was awful. Sometimes torture means it's something that's hurting your body. In this case, torture is something that's hurting her heart, hurting her soul, making her feel really sad because it's so hard for her. When Sue Ellen read her page or Tommy Bob read his page, they read so easily that Trisha would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their heads that wasn't happening to hers. And numbers were the hardest thing of all to read. She never added anything right. "Line the numbers up before you add them," the teacher would say. But when Trisha tried, the numbers looked like a stack of blocks, wobbly and just ready to fall right over. She just knew she wasn't smart. That's a really sad way to feel like you're not smart. And that's how Trisha was feeling. And sometimes we feel that way, but really, it's just not true. Everybody has different things that they're really good at. What is Trisha really good at? Really good at drawing pictures. And reading is harder, but that doesn't make her not smart. It's just how she feels. And then one day her mother announced that she had gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. So even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and the kids in her new school wouldn't know how hard it was for her to read and do math. She and her mother and brother moved all the way across the country in a two-tone, that means two different colors, 1949 Plymouth. That's the name of the type of car they were in. And it took them 5 days. It was a very long drive across the whole country. But at the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over her words. The cat, ran. She was reading like a much younger girl in 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Trisha for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. "Hey," a boy called to her on the playground. "How come you don't know how to read?" Other kids stood near him and they laughed. Trisha could feel tears burning in her eyes, and she just wished she could go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. She was feeling very sad. Now she's at a new school and still doesn't know how to read. Now Trisha wanted to go to school less and less and less. "I have a sore throat," she'd say to her mother when she really didn't. Or, "I have a stomach ache," she'd say to her mother when she really didn't. She dreamed more and more and more, and she drew more and more and more. And she really didn't like school. And then when Trisha started 5th grade, the school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant, which means fancy seeming. And everybody loved his striped coat and his slick gray pants, and he wore the neatest clothes. And all the usual teachers' pets gathered around him. A teacher's pet is a way to describe someone who in the class always wants to have the teacher's attention and help the teacher and say the right thing and do the right thing and always do everything right and never has any trouble with reading or doing math or anything like that. It's just a way to describe someone who maybe looks like they are the favorite of the teacher, when really, I can tell you that teachers love all of their kids, all of them. So even the ones like Trisha who are struggling, teachers love them all. The ones that don't have a hard time and the ones that do have a hard time, we love you equally as much. But they felt like when Mr. Falker came in, all of the ones that loved school and had no trouble were just right there wanting to help him and have his attention all the time. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Falker which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. He loved them all. Mr. Falker would stand behind Trisha whenever she was drawing, and he would whisper, "This is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" Talented means really good at something. When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings, but they still laughed whenever she gave a wrong answer. Now, do you know what it means when someone teases someone else? It's sometimes meant to be funny and fun, and it doesn't hurt the feelings of the person who's being teased. But in this case, they're teasing her about something that's hard for her. And so that definitely hurts her feelings and makes her sad when people laugh at her or say things about how hard it is for her to read and do math. And then one day she had to stand up and read, which she hated. Hated's not a word that I would typically feel comfortable using, but when we're talking about how much she disliked reading in front of people, that's a word that really describes how she felt, because it felt embarrassing. It made her very sad. It made her very worried. And so that's the word that describes how she felt when she had to read in front of people. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, which is a beautiful book, but kind of hard to read. And the page was going all fuzzy when the kids began to laugh right out loud. Mr. Falker, in his plaid jacket and his butterfly tie, said, "Stop. Are all of you so good at everything you do that you can look at another person and find fault with her?" Now, finding fault with something just means that you are looking at something to point out what is wrong with it. And that's what they did when Trisha read out loud. That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her, all except Eric. One kid who had sat behind Trisha for 2 whole years in school. Trisha didn't know why, but he never stopped teasing her. He waited by the door of the classroom for her. He sometimes pulled her hair. He waited for her on the playground. He leaned in and said mean things to her. Trisha was afraid to turn any corner because she was afraid Eric would be there. She felt totally alone. So even though she has a teacher who cares deeply about her, she has other kids who care about her, she has one kid at school who makes her sad and uncomfortable. And because of that, she's afraid and doesn't even like to be there. So think about that and how that must have felt to her. Not good. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards, which are like the whiteboards now. They used to be black. We have one in our classroom with the little chalk that you can use on it. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back whenever she got something right, and he looked hard at any kid who teased her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Trisha, the worse it felt Eric was. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria or even in the bathroom and to sometimes call her names that made her sad. And she began to believe that the mean things they said about her were true. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide and not play with anyone until recess was over, and then she could go back to class. So remember, I told you some of the parts of this book might make you feel sad. They certainly make me feel sad. But as we go on, I think you'll like how things turn out. But one day at recess, Eric followed her and found her in her hiding place. And once again, he teased her. Suddenly Mr. Falker came. He marched Eric down to the office, and when he came back, he found Trisha. "I don't think you'll have to worry about him teasing you anymore," he said nicely. "What does he tease you about, little one?" "I don't know," Trisha shrugged. Shrug is what you do with your body when you don't know the answer to something. Like if someone asks you a question you don't know the answer to. Trisha didn't know why Eric teased her so much. And when he asked her, she shrugged. That's what you do with your shoulders. "I don't know." Trisha was sure Mr. Falker believed that she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading. Or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence, and then she'd say something like that was the same as he said. "Good," he would say. But then one day, Mr. Falker helped her stay after school and asked her to wash the blackboards. He put on music and brought out little sandwiches, and they worked together and talked. And all at once he said, "Let's play a game. I'm going to say a letter, and I want you to write it on the board with a wet sponge as quickly as you can." "A," he shouted, and she wrote an A with the sponge. "8," he shouted, and she made an 8. 14, 3, D, M, Q. He shouted so many letters and numbers that he walked up behind her, and together they looked at the board. It was a watery mess. Trisha knew that none of the letters or numbers looked like they were supposed to. She put the sponge down and tried to run away. But Mr. Falker caught her arm and sank to his knees in front of her. "You poor baby," he said. "You think that you're not smart, don't you? How awful for you to feel that way." And she cried. "But little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters or numbers the way other people do. And you've gotten through school all this time, and you have fooled many, many very good teachers." He smiled at her. "That took so much smartness and such bravery." Then he stood up and finished washing the board. "We're going to change all that, girl. You're going to read. I promise you that." Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy, a reading teacher. They did a lot of things she didn't even understand. At first, she made circles in sand, and then big sponge circles on the blackboard, going from left to right, left to right, left to right. Another day they flicked letters on a screen and Trisha shouted them out loud. And still other days she worked with wooden blocks and built words. Letters, 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 words, 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 always sounding them out. And that felt good. But though she'd read the words, she hadn't read a whole sentence. And deep down, she still didn't feel smart. But though she'd read words, I already read that. And then one spring day, had it been 3 months or 4 months since they started, Mr. Falker put a book in front of her. She had never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of a page and pointed to it. And almost as if it were magic, a light poured into her brain. The words and sentences started to take shape on the page as they had never before. She marched them off to... Slowly she read a whole sentence. And then another, and finally she'd read a whole paragraph. A paragraph is a big group of words. I'll show you a paragraph in a second. And she understood everything she had read. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy had tears in their eyes. Not sad tears, happy tears, because she had read a paragraph. So if you look at the paper here, in kindergarten we don't have an opportunity to read a lot of paragraphs, but if you see here where the word starts over there a little bit, and then it ends here and that whole extra line is empty, all of these words are a paragraph. And then a new paragraph starts where the next word is indented or pushed in further than the other words. So this page has 1, 2, short 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 paragraphs. Okay? So a paragraph is just a group of words that all make sense together. A sentence is one part of a paragraph. And she read a paragraph all by herself. That night, Trisha ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps, threw open her front door, and ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up on the cupboard and grabbed a jar of honey. And then she went into the living room and found the book on a shelf, the very high book that her grandpa had shown her so many years ago. And she spooned the honey onto the cover and tasted the sweetness, and she said to herself, "The honey is sweet, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like the bee who made the honey. It has to be chased through the pages of a book." Then she held on the book, honey and all, close to her chest. She could feel tears roll down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. She was happy. So very happy. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure. An odyssey is a long, fascinating journey or trip. So for the rest of her 5th grade school year, it was like a journey through learning and discovering new things and having adventures. She learned to love school. I know that because that little girl was me, Patricia Polacco. I saw Mr. Falker again 30 years later at a wedding, and I walked up to him and I introduced myself, and at first he had difficulty placing me, and then I told him who I was and how he had changed my life so many years before. He hugged me and he asked me what I did for a living. "Why, Mr. Falker," I answered, "I make books for children." "Thank you, Mr. Falker. Thank you." So, in that book, you get to hear about how long it takes people to learn certain things. Patricia Polacco was Trisha in the story. So what we now know is that not only did Patricia Polacco become one of the best readers in the world, she chose to write books for a living. So words that were so hard for her to figure out when she was a kid became the most important thing in her life, along with her drawings, which were always easy for her and she was always good at. But I love this story because it talks about how important it is, even when something is hard to do, to keep working on it, because you have the ability to make it not only something that you learn how to do, but something that you love to do by continuing to work on it, because we don't all learn things at the same time and in the same way. And she really, really really had to work hard to do something that turned out to be the great love of her life, and that's writing stories. So I love, love, love this story and the light bulb that goes on for her, because that's what happens when kids learn. You learn little tiny things, and every time you learn a little thing, it's like a light bulb goes on in your head, and then it's there. It's knowledge that's stuck in your head, something you know that's stuck in your head. So one of my favorite books. I hope you liked it too. And then a poem that kind of goes along with it, another Shel Silverstein poem. It's called A Light in the Attic. It's actually the same title of the poem as this book is titled. Sometimes when you have a poetry book, the poetry, one of the poems in the book is what becomes the name of the book. And so that's what has happened here. A Light in the Attic is the name of this whole book, and it's also the name of the poem that I'm going to read that goes along with the story that we just heard in a little bit of a way. We'll see if you can figure out how they go together. There's a light on in the attic. Though the house is dark and shuttered, I can see a flicker and flutter, and I know what it's about. There's a light on in the attic. I can see it from the outside, and I know you're on the inside, looking out. So in this case, his illustration helps you to understand the story. It's as if your head is like a house, and the attic in the house is your brain. And when there's a light on in there, there's something going on. You're learning something new. You're thinking about something that you haven't thought about before, or you're thinking about something you have thought about before. It's just your brain at work. And that's how learning works, just like it did in the story. So I hope you like that kind of silly little poem about the light on in the attic. And I hope you loved the book, one of my favorites. And I'll see you again tomorrow.